How's it going, everybody? My name is Lee Woodmansee, and I'm the discipleship pastor here at Immanuel Baptist Church. And what I wanted to do is in this brief video is actually fill in some gaps from our series on the Gospel of John. We necessarily had to make some cuts in material into what we would cover on Wednesday nights and what we wouldn't. And so I'm going to try to fill in some of those gaps right here, right now. And so last week, in our fourth week, we covered John chapter 3, starting in verse 1, and we went all the way through verse 21. And so what I want to do is I want to fill in that gap, and we're going to pick it up in 22, and we're going to go through the rest of the chapter, and I want to work through some material that we're just necessarily not going to get to cover elsewhere. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw these slides up here, and so we're just going to follow along, and I'm going to read the text, explain a little bit, and we'll just go from there. So what I want to do first is I want to give us a little bit of a recap from what we talked about in John chapter 3 from last week. And so this is where we were last time. The number one thing that I really want us to remember is that from this scene that we see in John chapter 3 verses 1 all the way through verse 15, I think we can extrapolate that Nicodemus is not regenerate, that he is not a fully fledged believer in Jesus, that he hasn't had the Spirit work in his heart. And so what we are left with is just recognizing that here in John chapter 3, he's not a believer. He's not a follower of Jesus. We'll see him later in the gospel, and then eventually in John chapter 19, we'll see him a third time. And I think at that point, that's when he is a believer. But right now, I don't think he is. And through this conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus, I think it became really clear that one of the main points we need to see is that religious knowledge without the Spirit's activity in our lives is useless. It's not enough to save us. Nicodemus had the correct theological orthodox pedigree of religious knowledge, but he wasn't saved. And so I think that that's something that we need to see as being a big deal here. And so what Jesus does is he actually confronts Nicodemus's not lack of knowledge, but he's confronting his unwillingness to accept Jesus' testimony. If you want to, you can go back and watch the YouTube video or listen to the session on audio only where we talk about that Nicodemus kept wanting to play the we game, that we know you come from heaven. And so Jesus does the same thing, that you don't accept our testimony because we know, and he's speaking about himself and the Father, and that there's this testimony. And then the last thing we talked about is that we desperately need the Spirit's activity in our lives. We desperately need that. One of the last things that I really talked about was that we were going to have to come back around to explaining why I thought chapter 3 verses 16 through 21 were not actually Jesus's words to Nicodemus, but they were actually our author, John the Apostle. And so that's where we're heading today. That's going to be the first thing we're going to talk about, is I'm going to address how I am justifying that 3:16 through 21 isn't actually part of the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, but in fact what that is, it's extra comments from John the Apostle, and that's him speaking. And then from there, we're going to look at verses 22 through 30, where we see your boy Johnny B show up on the scene one more time, and we're going to see how he is describing himself as inferior to Jesus, who is then superior. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to look at verses 31 through 36, which I think, again, is our author, John the Apostle, giving us commentary about his thoughts about Jesus being supreme. And we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to have just some final thoughts, and then we will be wrapped up from here. So let's talk about that first lingering issue that I didn't settle all the way from last session. And what I'd mentioned is that when we look in John chapter 3 verses 16 through 21, I don't think this is actually Jesus speaking to Nicodemus. I think in John chapter 3 you hear Nicodemus speak in verse 9, but then he kind of fades to the background in verse 15, and then he's just out of the scene completely. And so what we have in verses 16 through 21 is actually John the Apostle speaking about certain things that is going to help his audience, which is us, his readers. And so what is some of the evidence that I give for that? Well, I think there's a lot, but I want to boil it down to just really one thing that I think grammatically actually helps us out, and that's actually word choice. Whenever you look in the Greek for what it is that John the Apostle is writing for the entire gospel narrative here in our fourth epistle, or our fourth gospel account, we see that he actually chooses very precise words for a reason. One of those that you see over and over again is when Jesus is speaking of the Father. However, let's read verse 16 real quick. In John 3:16 says this, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." And in one of the most, if not the most famous verse in the entire Bible, there's actually a pretty unique set of words that get used here that, frankly, Jesus never really uses. But you know who does? John. the apostle. So the first one that he uses there is ha theos. And this description, ha theos, means God, right? That's just the word theos is just the word for God. And that ha there, that O with the apostrophe, what that is just the God. And so what we mean is God. There's only one God. And so this is really a person that we're talking about here. Whenever Jesus refers to God, he calls him the Father or my Father. He never uses the term in John's gospel, ha theos, to describe God the Father, because he has a more personal relationship, and that's just the word choice that Jesus uses. And so I think here, John is just following suit. Not only that, there's another term that Jesus never uses in John's gospel, and that's monogenes. And monogenes is the only son, his only begotten son, right? This is a term that John will use not only in the Gospel of John, but also in his epistles. And what we see is that Jesus never uses that word. And so I think even just from the word choice twice in the first sentence of this new section, I think this is John's way of alerting his audience, his readers, us, of saying this is not Jesus talking to Nicodemus. This is me speaking to you. In fact, I know part of this is going to be editorial comments, because when we look to verse 22 through 24, it's not a scene that is being described as a conversation between two people. It's actually John setting the scene for a change in time and space. We've gone from the night when Nicodemus was there speaking with Jesus to now there's a whole other scene, at least in another day, in another location. And so John sets the stage. So John will routinely enter into the narrative to give us some of these editorial comments. But here's the point that I really want to make. When we look in verses 16 through 21, what we are getting is these reflections of John the Apostle that have been distilled down over decades of following Jesus. And this is where we get this conversation about those who are rejecting Jesus are already condemned, and that we see that there is this light and this darkness. And this is just theological reflections from John the Apostle over decades. And so that's my main contention. And so with that in the back of our head, let's cover the ground that we aren't going to cover on Wednesday nights whenever we're meeting in there. And I just want to read a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit. So let's look at John chapter 3, verses 22 through 30. And I'm going to look at this as one big chunk, as Jesus is being described as being superior, and therefore John the Baptist is inferior. So let's look at verses 22 through 24 real quick. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John was also baptizing at Aenon near Salim, because water was plentiful there, and people were coming and being baptized. And then verse 24, for John had not yet been put in prison. So here's what I want to say. Number one, I think this is locating us temporally, chronologically, in a scene that is taking place well before Mark chapter 1, verse 14. And this is just before Jesus is entered into ministry outside of where he previously was there in Jerusalem. And then now he is about to launch into the Galilean ministry. And I think this is part of that, but it's preceding it. And my only point that I want to make with this is that this is another clear reference of how John the Apostle is assuming that we are familiar with the chronology and the storyline from the other synoptic gospels. And so we are seeing that this is taking place before Mark chapter 1, verse 14. So let's read the next bit, verses 25 through 26. Now, a discussion arose between some of John's disciples, that is John the Baptist, your boy Johnny B, and a Jew over purification. And they came to your boy Johnny B and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, Jesus, of whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and people are going to him. So what we get from this is that Jesus and John the Baptist, their ministries are actually overlapping. And in fact, they're baptizing in the same place. We don't get any evidence that Jesus himself was baptizing people, but he was likely overseeing his disciples baptizing like John's disciples were doing as well. But here's the point, that they are overlapping. And when that happens, there's an opportunity for conflict, because the question was about purification. But then whenever John's disciples come to him, they say, hey, look, there are people who are leaving following you, and they're going to follow Jesus. Like, what do we want to do about this? And I think there's just a really interesting point for us here is that there is always going to be this opportunity for jealousy or whatever it may be when it comes to ministry, that your numbers aren't stacking up like that guy's. And here's where we see your boy Johnny B start to show this amazing humility. We've said all along from back in John chapter 1, verses 6, 7, and 8, that Jesus is the one to whom John is constantly pointing, and he is always sending people to Jesus. And here, confronted with this reality of people are stopping following your boy Johnny B and they're following Jesus, what is it that John says? So let's look in verses 27 through 30. And this is what we read. John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given to him from heaven. And you yourselves bear witness to me, or bear witness for me, that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. And therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, and I must decrease." I want to give us 4 ways that we see how exactly John is acting in his humility. And number 1, let's look in verse 27. John answered, "A person cannot receive one thing unless it is given him from heaven." John is recognizing the Spirit's activity, just like Jesus was trying to get Nicodemus to understand in the last section from the first half of John chapter 3. Here, John is saying, hey, I don't have a single thing unless it was given to me by God. I must have only any success that the Spirit would give me. And he's saying it's not about me. So he says, you need the Spirit as well. It has to be given from heaven, which is what Jesus was talking about with the Spirit earlier. Let's look there in the next verse, in verse 28. You yourselves bear witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. So in his humility, one more time, he recognizes and reminds them he is not the one who saves them. His role is to point to the one who will. And so he just says, look, you remember, I said I'm not the Christ. I've been telling you this whole time. It's not about me. Verse 29, he says this. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. And what I see from this is that there is this joy that comes. He says, therefore, my joy is now complete because the bridegroom's here and I'm hearing his voice and he's right over there. You should go talk with him. That's something that we've seen over and over because he says, I'm not the bridegroom. I'm just the friend. I'm not the bridegroom. I'm just his friend, and I get to partake in this joy. And that is amazing that we should see it the way that John does. And so what we come back around to is saying that John is constantly going to be pointing to Jesus. Let's look at this last verse in verse 30. And what, let's just read it. Verse 30. He, speaking of Jesus, he, the bridegroom, must increase, but I must decrease. And so here is the deal. In John, in his gospel, this is the last time that we hear your boy Johnny B, and his words are very fitting. His words are incredibly fitting because the last thing we hear John say is, I need to start fading to the background and he needs to start taking precedence. He is the one whom I have testified to, and y'all need to be hearing from him more and more. And in my contention, that's the last time we hear your boy Johnny B. But that's not the last time we hear from John the Apostle. And so let's look in verses 31 through 36, and let's talk about these comments that we see from John. So let's just pick it up in verse 31, and we'll just read that right now. He who comes from above is above all, and he who is on the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He who comes from heaven is above all. And here's where I think John, the apostle, is trying to help us out, and he's trying to call back to that conversation with Nicodemus, and he says, John is the one who is from below, but Jesus is from above, and he was sent, and he was commissioned to go and proclaim the gospel and for you to believe in him. And I think this is John's comments of saying, hey, as I think about your boy Johnny B, and as I think about Jesus and Nicodemus, what I'm reminded of is that Jesus is the one who came from above. In the same way that we must have the Holy Spirit act in our lives, we have to have God the Father send the Son so that we might be able to hear and have salvation accomplished on our behalf. Yeah? So that's what verse 31 says. Let's look at verses 32 and 33. John goes on to say, and he says this, he bears witness to what he has seen and heard, yet no one receives his testimony. He, Jesus, the Son, he bears witness to what he has said, but no one receives his testimony. Nicodemus, right? That's the conversation from last session. He says that no one receives his testimony. Verse 33, whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. And this is what I want us to see, is that Jesus is speaking for the Father here. They are speaking in one voice, that their testimony is you must be born again, the Spirit must come, the Son must go forward, there must be salvation accomplished, and you must recognize that our only hope is in salvation through the Son. And that's about as simple and as plain as I think I can make it. Let's drive on to this next section. Let's look at verse 34. For he whom God has sent, the Son, he utters the words of God. For he, that's the Father, for he gives the Spirit without measure. And I think this is in reference to Jesus. And so what we should get there is that Jesus is the one who fundamentally has the Spirit without measure. And I think the point there, and maybe you'll see some of this later, and I know in our final thoughts, but you might be seeing it here. We have the Father, we have the Son, and we have the Spirit all coming together, and that this is a singular act from the Godhead, from the Trinity, that is sending the Son and the Spirit and testifying to what the Father has accomplished for us so that we might be saved. And Jesus is the one who is full of the Spirit without measure. Let's look at verse 35. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. And I think this is an idea of that Jesus has all authority. Not only does he have the Spirit without any kind of measurement, it is beyond measure, he also has all authority. And that's what we actually see coming out in Matthew 28. All authority has been given to me, and I'm sending y'all out. I think this is yet another hint that John the Apostle is assuming that we are aware of the synoptics, and specifically Matthew 28. And so the Father has given Jesus all authority, and then let's round it out there in verse 36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, and whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. And this is where I think John the Apostle is tying together a whole lot of different themes from all of John chapter 3. Start thinking back to John chapter 3, verse 9. How can this be? How can I be born again? And then Jesus says, man, you're the teacher of Israel. How do you not understand this? The Son of Man must be lifted up, and you must recognize his testimony about himself, and that the Spirit would come and work in your life, because the Son of Man didn't come into the world to judge and condemn you. You're already condemned. And then when you read verse 36, it says, whoever does not obey the Son is not going to see life, but they are going to feel the wrath of God because it remains on them. I think this is John distilling all those decades of following Jesus, and he says, this is the whole point, fellas. Everything that we need to know about salvation is contained right here. So I think that's roughly as much as I want to say about this section. So let's talk about a couple of final thoughts, and then this video will be over. Here's number one. We are always meant to point others to Jesus just the exact same way that your boy Johnny B did. He sets the example. John chapter 1, verses 6, 7, and 8. He is the one who is the example par excellence of how to testify about Jesus. We see him show up a little bit later in that chapter. We see him show up in John chapter 3 now. It's just clear that we are supposed to be pointing people to Jesus just the same way that your boy Johnny B did. Here's the second thing that I would say. Take note of that Trinitarian nature of this section. We see clearly the Father being spoken of, we see the Son being spoken of, and that the Spirit is indwelling Jesus in a way that is without measure. And I think that's really critical for us to see that the way that John is thinking about in this section with his comments about Jesus increasing and John the Baptist decreasing, he is viewing it through the lens of this Trinitarian nature and this expression of God on earth with Jesus incarnate and the Spirit indwelling what he experiences later. And he says, you got to understand all of this at some measure. We've got to see the Trinity coming through here. And here's the last thing I'll say. The acknowledgement that Jesus is the Son of God and what he has done and accomplished for us on the cross, that is the singular thing that determines our eternal destiny. Regardless of how we want to work through any of these other elements about how we view salvation and how that occurs, at the end of the day, it comes down to, what did you do with Jesus? And so I'll just ask us that question. Whenever we are thinking about recognizing who Jesus is, and we are thinking about recognizing what it is that he has accomplished for us on our behalf, it comes back down to, have you trusted in him or not? And so if you are new to this series and you stumbled upon this video, or if you've been watching along this whole time, hey, I'm glad you're here, but I just got one single question for you. Have you trusted Jesus? If you've never trusted in Jesus, I think all this other stuff, this religious knowledge, is great, but it will do nothing for you. It will not save you. And so I would just make an appeal. If you need to have a conversation, come talk with me. I would love to have that conversation. Whatever you need, you know how to get a hold of me. I'm super easy to find here at the church. My email, everything's on the website. I would love to talk with you. Next week, or the next session, we're going to be talking about John chapter 4, and we're going to be taking John chapter 4, verses 1 all the way through verse 42. And so it's going to be a huge chunk. And so hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully you're getting prepared for filling in the gaps with the rest of the Gospel of John as we work through this. If you've got any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. And the last thing I want to say, like I always do, is do good and don't sin.